A word or phrase that resonates. We're continuing here, 1236b. A word or phrase that resonates with the body's pre-verbal stirring and gives voice to it. I might come to realize, for instance, that what triggered my outrage was an underlying feeling of shame. So what started out as anger projected onto another dialogue participant transformed into an embodied realization of myself. Given some experience with focusing, such insight can come quickly enough to be shared with the group in the course of the dialogue session. By being radically open to ourselves in this pre-verbal way and sharing it with others who are doing the same, by listening deeply to one another in the course of our mutual sharing. PD fosters a sense of intimacy not possible in the verbal exchanges in conventional discourse. In sum, PD's paradigm of pre-verbal intimacy splits the atom, calling into question the post-Renaissance individual's mode of communication, wherein self and other are divided and interact superficially in a mechanical space of continuous speech. The role of polarity in proprioceptive dialogue. In the previous section, I indicated that the healing that can be brought about by splitting the post-Renaissance atom entails the release of energy. Taking a closer look at what this process involves will sharpen our understanding of PD. Analogous to atomic fission, where the splitting of atoms leads to the build-up of nuclear energy, a certain kind of intrapsychic energy is built up in the practice of PD. As indicated at the outset, in drawing back in upon myself, proprioceptively, my attention moves against the grain of ordinary discourse. Instead of relating to you by simply projecting my thoughts outwards in acts of speech that are oblivious to their pre-verbal origins. I counteract this outward thrust by moving my awareness inward so as to withdraw the projections. Why is intrapsychic energy generated by this operation? It is because the inward movement does not just come after the projection in a linear sequence, rather outward and inward movements are superimposed on each other and happen at once, and this polar opposition creates friction and energy-bearing psychic tension. I often experience this tension in my practice of PD. Groping for a felt sense of the pre-verbal source of my unrushing words and thoughts feel like swimming against a strong current. But if I can hold this tension, contain the psychic energy for a sustained period of time, without letting it dissipate, the energy may be released in the form of a novel self-insight. In my example, I suddenly realize that it isn't so much anger that I'm experiencing. At bottom, it's shame. In the metaphor of splitting the atom, for a critical mass to be reached that will eventuate in an energy-releasing chain reaction, the nuclear material must be compressed, held together to allow the energy to build. Psychologist Beth Macy sees holding the tension of polar opposites as integral to Bohemian dialogue. Working with philosopher Owen Barfield's concept of polarity, she gives a definition of it, taking from Barfield's conversation with psychologist Shirley Sugarman. Here polarity is seen as involving two counteracting and correlative forces that have separated themselves, forming two poles. Though the poles stand in opposition to each other, they are linked from within. Bohm illustrates this through his example of a magnet whose north and south poles are not separately existent, but are aspects of one unbroken magnetic field. The interconnectedness of the field is evidenced by the fact that if the magnet is broken apart, you get two magnets, each of which has a north and a south pole. Mechanistic thinking would lead us to expect that in breaking the magnet in two pieces, one piece would give only the north pole and the other only the south. But the field is not divisible in this way, for each piece of the magnet carries within it the north-south polarity of the whole field, and with opposite poles being thus connected to the whole, they are connected to each other. Mace's idea of polarity applies to the tensions that come into play in dialogue meetings, when feelings, thoughts, and conflicting assumptions rise to the surface. Initially, these tensions may reflect no more than egoic projections, uninformed by an awareness of their unconscious underpinnings. If the blind oppositional energies that have been constellated go unchecked for too long, the group container certainly could explode. The group needs to hold the tensions long enough to transform them from merely external and potentially explosive oppositions into polar oppositions wherein opposites are internally linked. In PD, the transformation happens through proprioception. I have already described the intrapsychic polarity entailed in proprioception. I now suggest that proprioceptive activity of this kind, where opposing movement of consciousness, projection and proprioception, are inwardly joined sets that stage for interpsychic polar relations. To form in the group field. It is by going against the grain of my projection that I can gain an insight into myself that can then be shared with the group. A gesture that invites others to reciprocate. In group proprioception that ensues, the atom is split without explosion. For a field of intimate linkages among the participants has been created, akin to the magnetic field described by Bohm. Instead of blowing apart, the group can now evolve as new meanings emerge that advance its creative exploration. For David Bohm, collective innovation of this sort is a primary goal of dialogue. To be sure, a dialogue group governed by polarity is not all sweetness and light. Tensions tend to persist. There are differences among the members that can bring friction and edginess. But proprioceptive sharing facilitates a cohesiveness that takes the group beyond the mechanical transactions of separate egos butting up against each other. These atoms have indeed been split, and the energy thereby released enables the group to function more like jazz players in an improvisational jam session. With each member spontaneously expressing her or his unique impulses and understandings, while just as much being in dynamic flow with all the other players. The paradox of PD. Now Macy emphasizes the paradoxical nature of such polarity. Though polar opposites are interdependent and interpenetrating, they embody the tension of their difference. How can we clarify the enigmatic interplay of identity and difference that underlies the polarities of PD? To bring this paradoxical form of interaction graphically into focus, we turn to a well-known oddity from the psychology of perception. The Necker cube, figure 1, is a reversible figure that projects opposing three-dimensional perspectives from a two-dimensional plane. You may be perceiving the cube from the point of view in which it seems to be hovering above your line of vision, when suddenly a spontaneous shift occurs and you see it as if it lay below. Two disparate perspectives certainly are experienced in the course of gazing at the cube. But the cube's reversing perspectives overlap one another in space. Are internally related, completely interdependent. Think of what would happen to one perspective if the other were erased. To model more effectively the paradoxical character of dialogical polarity, let us attempt to go a step further in our perception of the cube. Ordinarily, our glance is limited to merely oscillating from one perspective of the cube to another. But we can actually break this visual habit and view both perspectives at once. In figure 2, I added some volume to the Necker cube. I flashed it out a bit. This modification should make it easier for you to see what I'm talking about. When the cube's polar perspectives are integrated, as I'm suggesting, there is an uncanny sense of self-penetration. The cube appears to do the impossible, to go through itself. Here the temporal divergence of viewpoints is surmounted. Here the temporal divergence of viewpoints is surmounted in the creation of an experiential structure whose opposing perspectives are simultaneously given. but the word simultaneous may not exactly fit. I am proposing that we can apprehend the cube in such a way that its differing viewpoints overlap in time as well as in space. Yet, what we actually experience when this happens is not simultaneity in the usual sense of static juxtaposition. We do not encounter opposing perspectives with the same immediacy as figures appearing side by side in conventional space. Figures that coexist in an instant of time, simply common to them, as for example the letters of the words on this page. And yet there is indeed a temporal coincidence in the integrative way of viewing the cube. For perspectives are not related in simple succession, first one and then the other, any more than in spatial simultaneity. And yet there is indeed a temporal coincidence in the integrative way of viewing the cube. For perspectives are not related in simple succession, first one, then the other, any more than in spatial simultaneity. If opposing faces are not immediately co-present, neither do they disclose themselves merely seriatim. In the externally mediated fashion of linear sequence. Instead, the relation is one of internal mediation, of the mutual permeation of opposites. Perspectives are grasped as penetrating each other in a manner that blends space and time so completely that they are no longer recognizable in their familiar, categorically dichotomized forms. You can see this most readily in the viewing of the fleshed out cube. When you pick up on the odd sense of self-penetration of this seemingly impossible figure, you experience its two modalities neither simply at once, nor one simply followed by the other one. As in the ordinary, temporarily broken manner of perception. Rather you apprehend the dynamic merging and separating of opposing perspectives. Or in the words of Jungian theorists Nathan Short Salam, the intimate interplay of polar opposites entails a paradoxical process in which outer and inner are alternatingly both distinct and the same. And this is essentially what happens with proprioception, where the movement of awareness inward to the proverbal body is an inseparable aspect of the projective movement outward in language. Here attention pushes back against itself, creating intense polar opposition. If the tension can be held until a critical mass is reached, the intrapsychic energy that has been generated can be released as a novel insight. Even as my anger is projectively expressed in language, the proprioceptive passage to anger's proverbial source brings a tensive awareness that eventuates in realization of my underlying shame. We have seen, moreover, that PD carries this intrapsychic paradox into the paradox of field relations that develop in this group. In the course of sharing our proprioceptions, we merge dynamically, even as we separate. We are alternatingly both distinct and the same. As we strike new notes in our dialogical jazz, evolve fresh meanings in the ongoing process of creative exploration. Valuable as it is in tangible modeling, PD's polarity of inner and outer, self and other, subject and object, the Necker cube does have its limitation. In past writings I have appealed to a qualitative field of mathematics known as topology, where paradoxical structures like the Möbius strip and the Klein bottle have proven helpful. The Klein bottle in particular is a higher order counterpart that has been effective in offering a more complete account of subject-object interconnectedness, while the application of topology to proprioceptive dialogue is beyond the scope of the present paper. I have it in mind for future work. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant evening. Bye bye for now.